This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In our newsroom, we've been having a lot of conversations about how we cover the Israel-Hamas war. And sometimes we find ourselves conflicted about who to talk to, what stories to cover, the language we use, and what we can do to make our coverage as fair and truthful as possible. As journalists, we understand that how we cover war can really shape public opinion about that war. Today, we're talking about just that. And because this conversation didn't just start with the recent Israel-Hamas war or even the Russia-Ukraine war. Joining us now to talk about all of this is Professor Scott Wallace. He's an associate professor in the Department of Journalism at the University of Connecticut. Scott, welcome to Where We Live today.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here.
And also with us is Adrian Bonenberger. He's a writer and journalist who published pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and many other outlets. He was also deployed twice to Afghanistan with the U.S. Army. Adrian, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to start with you, Adrian. We know that the media can play an enormous role in shaping public opinion about war, as we mentioned earlier. And before we talk about what's happening right now, I want to ask, how has this played out in different wars and conflicts in our history, such as war in Afghanistan, Iraq, World War II, and even more recently, the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think there's always a push and pull between what journalism, what the media wants to cover and what they're given access to by militaries. There's a kind of paradox in war, to get right to it, which is that we have our understanding of war from the outside, and then there's where the war is happening, which is in a city or in trenches. And a journalist getting to that place where the war is happening physically is very difficult because there are no rules there. And as a result, no military has a vested interest in bringing a journalist to war. When I was in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer, the New York Times embedded with my unit on my second deployment. And it was very important for me to get them to that place for that reason, so they could see what was happening. But there are a lot of challenges, I think, both for the military, for the government, and then for media to get journalists to the place where they can accurately and effectively cover war as it happens.
And Scott, I want to go back in time a little bit just to get some historical context. Can you talk about the history of how the media has influenced the Vietnam War and also our opinions about it?
Yeah, very interesting. If you look at the early coverage of the Vietnam War, early on, before it really became an American war, and, with the huge deployment that Lyndon Johnson carried forward in 1964-65, a schism developed, opened up between the press and the U.S. officials and the Saigon government by 1961-62. And part of that schism, this was really the first time that the press in the post-World War II era, that the press really exerted itself as a kind of adversarial force. A lot of that had to do actually with the divide that was developing within the U.S. government itself, largely between people on the ground, mid-level officers who were speaking to the journalists, the resident journalists in Saigon, and showing them the war and telling them that it was, that the war was not being prosecuted in the way that would result in a positive outcome. And the official line imparted by the U.S. Embassy and the White House and the State Department back in Washington. So there was actually a schism inside the government that also was reflected in the press. Probably, clearly as the war went on, the more difficult that war became, and as the casualties mounted, and as we, laid waste to vast stretches of the country, and then into Cambodia and Laos, it became clear that there was the gulf between press coverage and the official line in Washington widened. I think as a result of Vietnam, the those involved in media policy and public relations in the Pentagon and elsewhere were determined not to to control the press better and to control the narrative and control access to the front lines. In Vietnam, the reporters had extraordinary access to, speaking to Adrian's point, the press had extraordinary access. They could just hop on helicopters and find themselves in the midst of combat, and there wasn't a great deal of control over their coverage. In Central America, where I worked as a correspondent in the 1980s, where the U.S. was supporting and arming the belligerent sides in El Salvador, to some extent in Guatemala, and the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, we enjoyed an amazing access to all sides of the conflicts. It was harder to get to the Guatemalan guerrillas. It was very dangerous, but to get to the guerrillas in El Salvador, for example, or the Contras in Nicaragua was not that difficult, although, of course, there were dangers involved. But that allowed us to move quite freely back and forth between the countries and across the front lines. And so that was an interesting situation. But, by the time the Gulf Wars came around, the invasion of Panama kind of kicked that off. And the Gulf Wars, access to both sides of the story began to shrink, if you will. And it's been clearly much more difficult in recent years for reporters to cover, both sides, or how many other sides they may be besides the two. Just being a Westerner in certain contexts, as we've seen with ISIS in the Middle East, reporters who've tried to get into Syria and elsewhere, who have been captured and beheaded gruesomely, kind of speaks to the issue of how difficult it can be to access the front in these wars.
Well, we definitely are going to get into more about the accessibility for press in a little bit. But Scott, I also want to talk about, there seems to be a lot of parallels right now between Vietnam and the Israel-Hamas war, where there is a schism on how to cover this conflict. Can you talk about what we're seeing right now in the Israel-Hamas war and how the media is covering this war? Are you seeing an echo of the gulf that you spoke on between the governments and the press?
Yes, I am. It's a little bit of a different situation. I would say there's also, pretty significant gulf between American coverage of the conflict and the coverage provided by European outlets and other outlets around the world, Middle Eastern outlets. American coverage, I think, for the most part, tends to be Israel is our ally. We share a lot of commonality there with the Israelis, and I think that kind of makes the coverage more challenging for American journalists to provide, fair and balanced coverage. It's also very difficult, of course, to get to the front lines in the Gaza war unless you're embedded with the Israeli Defense Forces. It's a really dangerous conflict. Some 70 or so Palestinian reporters and media workers have been killed since the reprisals against the horrific October 7th attack kicked off this conflict. So there is a lot of dissonance, I would say, in trying to cover this conflict, and within the Israeli press and within Israel's, broader society, there's definitely a schism opening up too between, the more between, I would say, perhaps mainstream Israeli society and the more conservative hard right elements in the Netanyahu government. And that's reflected in Israel's press coverage as well.
And Adrian, we covered a lot of ground just now, but you've been listening and following. Are there any points that Scott's made that you want to respond to?
Yeah, I think not so much respond add a kind of a little bit of context, which is that I think probably few of the listeners to this program, but many people who consume media may be under the misapprehension that a person with a cell phone or a smartphone is a journalist. So a person recording a fact is a journalist. So what we're talking about, I think, here is press and press access. And being a journalist, and I think this is a pretty important point, because being a journalist is obeying a set of professional ethics and standards that's not dissimilar to being a scientist, in that you have sources, you have things that you write into an article such that any journalist should be able to go to the sources that you've gone to and create, 95% to 100% of the same article that you have. And a lot of the coverage where you don't have journalists ends up being rumor or a video that's completely out of context or an assumption. You hear an explosion, you think your family was in a building, or you think this is a particular military unit. It isn't. You've gotten some of the facts wrong. But by the time that account circulates, it's too late. And that's, in a sense, worse than no information, because bad information leads people to bad conclusions. So I don't know. I think Professor Wallace would probably find this interesting as well, and probably does, just this strange distinction that we have today and probably over the last decade, where you have the proliferation of people calling themselves citizen journalists, propagandists, well-meaning citizens, all of these things forming a kind of narrative tapestry that we probably think of as journalism, but it isn't that. It's something a little bit different from that. And then you have the press, who are somebody with an accredited media institution who's trying to embed with the 10th Mountain Division in Poland as they train Ukrainian soldiers, or who's trying to embed with an IDF unit and is then following journalistic practice.
I want to sort of press on that a little bit, because the landscape of what press is has certainly changed over the years, and there's definitely a set of journalistic standards that we follow as journalists, of course. But with this sort of advent of citizen journalists, we do sort of get a different kind of unfiltered information coming through. So what do you make of that? Because it's a relatively new, I think, landscape that we're working with as journalists, trying to balance the line between sending a video in that's not edited, let's say, versus a piece that has a lot of thought and processes that went through it. Not to say that video didn't have the same process, but there is sort of a difference here. Can you help us differentiate that, and how do we navigate that, both as a journalist and as a consumer of information?
Well, to begin with, like anybody who's written for a serious publication, and I'm not going to assign any names because I want to keep that, as broad as possible. The definition of a serious publication has worked with fact checkers, has worked with at least one editor and probably a layer of editors. May, if they're old enough, have worked with a copy editor. I can say that the pieces that I've published with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe have had, layers upon layers of edits before they were published, almost down to the word level, not just the sentence level. And so if you haven't really supported what you're writing with some sort of fact, then what you're writing is questionable. And I think that's important because you look at, say, information coming out about Ukraine, and I'll take an example of I think the question about Ukraine that I hear the most from people, the skepticism, is Ukraine is a corrupt country. And this is true, and it's very easy to see examples of corruption in Ukraine and Ukrainian society. But what's left out of that, the very important context that one needs to understand about Ukraine, is that the revolutions that happened in 2004 and 2014 were Ukrainian citizens who were really tired of the corruption. And a lot of the effort today, even I would say maybe the war, is a reaction against a certain type of opaque, unaccountable government that we ourselves as Americans, and I think just about anybody in the world, finds to be, they really dislike it. So if you don't have that context, then saying Ukraine is corrupt, you miss a very important point. That is, that's all over war. And I think, the difference between somebody in the press who's going to a frontline unit with the IDF or with the U.S. military, any formation. They're going to see what they see on the ground, and they're going to write what they see. And then an editor is going to look at that, and that editor has probably spoken with somebody in government and actually understands what the context of that is, and is then going to be able to present that as truth. Whereas, while it's useful and interesting and informative to be able to see videos at the point, at the time of what you're seeing, and those, I'm not saying that these things are useless. I'm just saying that it's something different from journalism. And another point that I would make really quickly with citizen journalists specifically is a person calling themselves a journalist, doing analysis, writing a thing, is still not a journalist if they're not obeying the principles of journalism, if they're not attempting to contextualize a thing and see things from all angles. So what they're writing is the truth rather than their opinion.
If I could jump in just for 1 second.
Sure, go for it.
Adrian's made some really good points there, but I'm not sure I would agree with, that an editor checking with the government provides, a check against inaccuracy. In a lot of cases, I have experienced myself the situation where, the government has a definite point of view, the official line, and things that that a reporter might see on the ground could contradict that. And yes, even if the reporter supports his arguments with facts, sometimes it turns out that the editor is more inclined, often is more inclined to listen to the government source in Washington than to trust the eyes and ears and judgment of the reporter on the ground in the country where things are, where the events are unfolding. I think that's particularly true, actually. In this, it's very interesting today. We have, more and more, a lot of the coverage is being provided by freelancers and so-called stringers, as news organizations have sought to cut back on expenses. The void is being filled more with freelancers, and often the editors don't trust their freelancers. In some cases, I would say, are less inclined to trust the freelancers who are reporting for them than the official source in Washington.
Well, I appreciate that a lot, just because I'm also a former freelance journalist, and I do see that a lot, even at the local level, really. And with the point that you just made, Scott, I want to ask about sourcing too. You mentioned sourcing, especially sort of the relationship between press and government officials, let's say. How much of that matters when it comes to covering conflict? Whether you're talking to people directly impacted by the war, involved in the war, from civilians to those on the front line in the Israel-Hamas war, to leadership. All those sources can provide very, very different perspectives. So how does who is featured and interviewed matter in this case?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
How does who is featured and interviewed matter?
I think it's tremendously important. The journalist, the professional journalist, such as the kind of journalist described by Adrian, will try to talk to as many people and as many types of sources as possible, sometimes because of time limitations or because it's too dangerous to get to sources on one side of a conflict, or impossible in some cases. But clearly, what the work that we do as journalists is largely, we do collect intelligence and information, and the stronger your sourcing is, the greater number of sources and the greater diversity of sources you have for a story, the more complete your report is going to be. The big difference, of course, being that we are reporting to the public and not clandestinely providing information to a government or a corporation. But the more sources you have, it's like putting together the pieces of a puzzle or a mosaic. And you might have a good idea of what you're starting out to write, but the good journalist will will notice that something he's just picked up from a source kind of throws off what he or she may have thought, prior to that interview. So the mosaic, the puzzle, is always in a process of evolution, and really depends on the thoroughness of a journalist, not only in covering and interviewing as many people and as wide a range of people as possible, but also doing, exhaustive research through documents and reports.
You've been listening to Professor Scott Wallace, who's an associate professor in the Department of Journalism at UConn. Thank you so much, Scott, for being on Where We Live today.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Adrian Bomberger, who is a writer and journalist, will be staying with us. Coming up next, social media means everyone and anyone can report and share their opinion on the war effort, and we talk about why that matters. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about how the news media influences public opinion on war. Still with us is Adrian Bomberger, who is a writer and journalist. And where are you getting your information on the Israel-Hamas war? Odds are you're probably hearing about this war through social media. Joining us now is Michael Spikes. He's a lecturer and program director at the Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Market and Communications at Northwestern University. Michael, thank you so much for joining Where We Live today.
Great to be here.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Michael, you've been following along the conversation. How are you seeing social media start to play a part in this conversation about Israel-Hamas war and how that's shaping public perceptions around it?
Yeah, I think the conversation in the last segment that was about citizen journalism, I think really plays a big part into how we might think about social media as playing a part in the information that people are getting about the war. As we heard, people have lots more opportunities to get what has been termed and was mentioned in the last segment as very unfiltered information that comes out of places like Ukraine, comes out of Israel, the West Bank, and so on. But a lot of times that unfiltered information is missing things like context, details, and all of the other things that we would hope that would help us as consumers to make meaning, to make sense out of what we're seeing. So I think in the dearth of those things, again, context, details, facts, we can tend to make misassertions of what we're seeing. And we're seeing that those misassertions of what we see are really causing people to have the wrong sort of perceptions of what actually may be going on.
And I think we saw a little bit of that, I think, with the advent of blogging. I feel like in the early 2000s when that became more popular, and now we're sort of extending that popularity into social media. So, Michael, I want to talk about, too, sort of, circumstances have changed how we cover a lot of stories. So can you talk about the role of citizen journalists in Palestine in particular?
Well, in particular, I think some of the things that we've been seeing is that they and lots of other citizen journalists have, or other media creators, even the media consumer has now become not only a consumer, but a producer of information, as we heard, like from that concept of the citizen journalist. And the platforms from which we are getting much more of the information that we use to get through our days is coming through these sort of, again, unfiltered, unmediated platforms such as Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and so on. And those platforms have allowed for, more and more users to have a very sort of frictionless procedure of both capturing information. We have smartphones that are on us all day long, that have cameras, that have microphones, that can allow us to capture information and then to quickly share it on these unmediated platforms. And I think one of the other things that's happening in particular with these conflicts, when we have this sort of unfiltered information get shared through them, and this is on the part of the consumer, there's a lot of uncertainty around what is going on. we may not have a lot of details on what is happening, why these things are happening, and we're only going off of sometimes what is the most extreme content that may be coming out of these conflicts. And it's giving people certain perceptions, again, of what's going on that may or may not be accurate about what's going on. So I think those things in particular, and we become much more susceptible when we have that sort of uncertainty going on about, what's happening. So I think we're seeing both of those things play out in today's, the multiple conflicts that are going on.
And to follow up on that, Michael, because this circumstance, I don't want to say it's really unique, but we are all following it live very closely on a daily basis. Can we or should we distinguish content creators from citizen journalists on the ground, which they've acknowledged is near impossible to access? We know that here as consumers, we're seeing it through social media. How can we distinguish the two different creators, content creators versus citizen journalists?
Well, in particular, I think the platforms have made it almost impossible for us to make to distinguish those things just through the process of scrolling through all of that information. It takes time for us to really create and grow and, learn about and really distinguish sources of information that have the intent and express intent to inform us and on what's happening. And I think for journalists, as we heard in the last segment, journalists have a set of procedures, methods, and also multiple individuals that get involved when between the process of capturing information, making meaning of that information, and then making sure that we, maybe I'll use the term, package that information so that it is understandable for the audience members. We heard about that in the last segment as information that goes through a journalistic organization. It goes through multiple editors. It goes through fact checkers and so on before it gets out to the public to make sure that that information is credible, that information is verified, and that it is correct when it gets to the audience members. I think that process is missing when we have people like the citizen journalists, we have the individuals, or in some cases, we may even have propagandists who have an agenda to push. We don't have those same sort of procedures in place. And in platforms like social media, all of these different players, all of the news organization, again, the propagandists, the individual, they are all playing in the same sandbox. And the platforms themselves do not have an incentive to make distinctions between all of those different players. So for the consumer, it's becoming more and more difficult for them because they now have to make that determination and figure out those distinctions on their own.
So, Adrian, I want to ask you to respond or add to this in a little bit, but I want to pose one more question to Michael before we get to that. Michael, a lot of people, especially younger generations, rely very heavily on social media for their news, including what's happening right now, what we're talking about. And I think we recognize that there is, of course, misinformation on these platforms, like you mentioned just now. But I want to also pose a question of, how does social media help fill those gaps? Especially, we talked about accessibility earlier at a time when international journalists aren't allowed on the ground in Gaza. Wouldn't we not know the reality on the ground in Gaza if we didn't have these citizen journalists?
That is very true. And that is I think, what we also have to add into the conversation, and I'm glad you bring that up, is that social media, for all of its ills, yes, has overly democratized media production and distribution. And what it has done is it has allowed for more people who did not have a voice, that got in that did not play in the same places where our gatekeepers, our traditional gatekeepers, the TV broadcasters, the newspapers, the publications that sort of stood in the way of us getting information. We now have a much more open system that allows us to hear varying points of view, allows us to get information from people who are on the ground, and it is very unfiltered. So that's been a great thing, that it has opened up those doors. But at the same time, I think what that democratization has done is it now has put onus on the consumer to, again, make distinctions between all of these different types of information and they get thrown at them. And I think these are new skills that all of us are having to take up. Journalists, again, I think have training on doing that, so they can, they can talk to multiple sources, they can suss out details, they can go out and verify information. But for the average consumer, yeah, we have Google, but even when you go to Google, you still have a lot of information that's coming at you that you have to make meaning of, and you have to take a lot of procedures through that. Lots of consumers just don't have those skills.
Yeah, I agree with just about everything that's been said. One of the first, there was a piece that I broke, probably the article that I am proudest of, which I ended up publishing on my blog after about a year of back and forth with a major publication who eventually paid me to spike it because they wouldn't run it. And the gist of this story, which even I didn't fully understand the ramifications of this story, was that the Russian military was far less powerful than a lot of people were saying. I published this piece in 2021. And I think talking about the utility of citizen journalism and just people walking down the street capturing something, a photo or a video with their smartphone and posting it to Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or what have you, is that in the aggregate you do get a sense of what is real. With the war in Ukraine, I knew that the Ukrainians were going to fight, and I knew that there was a portion of the Russian military that was wildly overhyped. I was incorrect in why I thought that. I had this in my head. I thought that it was kind of people in Washington, D.C. who had a vested interest in presenting a greater threat to sell, more a defense industry kind of thing. And it wasn't that. It was just that people sincerely believed that the Russians had modernized their military and they hadn't. We got that, in the first weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We got that from, videos of Ukrainians fighting all across Ukraine, Ukrainian farmers, hooking up tractors to tanks and driving them away, wild incompetence by Russian soldiers. Similarly, I think with the Israeli, first with the Hamas, attack on Israel, which was filmed and disseminated, and we got to see a lot of horrors and outrages. And then the Israeli military response going into Gaza, and we've seen the widespread devastation of the cities there. And seeing that, I've thought to myself, I wonder in 1991, during Desert Storm, if we had similar citizen journalism, if we'd have a different idea of what the war, that first, invasion of Iraq, really driving Iraq out of Kuwait would have looked like. We don't have that. We don't have access to that kind of widespread imagery. We just know that there was a lot of damage that was inflicted afterwards. We have accounts of this. So, I guess my overall thinking about this is that in the aggregate, you can see, the videos of the thing, the photos of the thing, and you get to come up with a picture of it. But that doesn't. On the other hand, you do have this. To me, it's not that I'm skeptical of citizen journalism. I really want people to understand and know that when you call yourself a journalist, you're essentially taking onto yourself a scientific mantle, the mantle of a scientist performing an experiment, 9th grade biology, 10th grade biology. You have to write out what the experiment is, and you have to do it in such a way, transparently, that anybody else can go and get the same results that you have. And I also don't want to disparage, people, if you see a plane fly overhead and drop a bomb on a building, take a video of that, take photos of that by all means. And there are things that can be extrapolated from that. But, the danger of that, thinking about, what the downside is, I don't know if you remember the opening of the invasion of Israel's invasion of, I think it was Gaza City, there was a hospital that was struck. And for 1 or 2 weeks afterwards, the account of that changed almost by the day. Was it an interceptor missile? Was it a Hamas rocket? Was it fuel? Was it a bomb? I honestly still do not know. I don't know what happened with that hospital. Does it really matter? No, a hospital got bombed in a war. That's that's the most salient fact. But It's the role of the journalist to say, okay, we have footage of this thing happening. Let's go to the place. Let's talk to people. Let's talk to the Israeli military and see if we can find, what the flight paths were of jets. Maybe they're not going to give you that information, but if you haven't tried, then you have no chance of saying, what's what. So, social media is wonderful. And I will say also that the solution that I've come up on, and I think probably most journalists have, is what you have, the opportunity you have with social media is to curate your own feed. So you take people that are in the business of journalism. You know that if they're not in the business of journalism, they're people of integrity, they're friends or relatives, people that you trust. You have some way of verifying that information. And by assembling a timeline or a feed on any of these social media outlets of those people, and taking out the people that are going to lie to you for partisan purposes on either side, you can come up with a pretty good approximation that's very responsive of what is happening in the world.
And Michael, we've only got about 2 minutes left here, but I do want to ask, one of your research areas is media literacy and misinformation, which are things that we've been talking about throughout this hour so far. Can you talk about what does media literacy look like when it's applied to social media and traditional media?
Well, I think in particular, what it should allow people to do is it gives them skills to do the things that were just mentioned, like to curate a feed, to find reliable and credible sources of information. I also think that what it allows people to do is to think about what are the intents of the creators of that content that's coming at me. And a lot of times we can sort of suss that out by, seeing the history of a particular outlet or a particular source, taking into account how independent that source is. Do they have something to gain by either sharing information in one, that gives you one perception or another, and other things like that. So it's also, it's like understanding, how does media work? How does it work on us? And also knowing, how do my own perceptions and backgrounds help me to understand information that I am seeking out, first of all, and information that's coming at me. So it's really, really important for people to take up these skills, especially in this varied media ecosystem that we have in front of us.
You've been listening to Michael Spikes. He's a lecturer and program director at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're also listening to Adrian Bomberger, who's a writer and a journalist. Adrian, thank you so much for being on today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And coming up next, we're going to hear about an investigation done by the Wall Street Journal on traditional media versus social media when it comes to news. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Coverage of the Israel-Hamas war has played out in traditional news media and social media. According to the Washington Post, TikTok videos on the Israel-Hamas war have drawn billions of views. This content can be at times relentless. Some content can be graphic, and social media companies struggle to monitor the content coming in. Still, social media can help fill in the gaps and bring in perspectives often left out of Western media. The Wall Street Journal decided to investigate what this looks like, specifically on TikTok. Joining us now is Georgia Wells. She's a tech reporter with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much, Georgia, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Georgia, can you start off by telling us about the onus for this reporting and investigation around TikTok?
Yeah, so we looked at TikTok because overwhelmingly that's where young teenagers are spending their time when they're on their phones. And what's interesting about TikTok is TikTok doesn't operate the way kind of some of the more traditional social media that we first started using, like Facebook, for example. Like on Facebook, you friend someone, you're connected with them, and then you see the types of content that they post. So there's a little bit of where that content is coming from. On TikTok, there's this sophisticated algorithm that it selects which video to show you. And there's a little bit of a like who you follow, who you like, but overwhelmingly that algorithm appears to be showing you content based on what you have previously engaged and rewatched and lingered on when you were watching videos. And so it means that when you watch something, it serves you more of that. But it's really hard to know, if you're a parent or a teacher or a researcher, it's hard to know the experience that like a specific young person might be having on TikTok unless you go back through their viewer history or you have kind of family pairing turned on, because you can't just scroll through who their friends are, who they're following and get a snapshot of the content they might be experiencing. So in order to really understand kind of the types of content some young people might be observing, we spun up these automated accounts that we referred to as our bots, and we programmed them to watch content. Or sorry, I should have mentioned, we really wanted to know what the experience young people were having when they were encountering content about this conflict in Gaza and Israel. And so we programmed these bots to rewatch content about this conflict and see what happened. And they became inundated with content about the conflict.
And how were you engaging with the content? Were you commenting, liking, or just watching the videos?
Just watching. We were not commenting or liking. It was very simple. If the video had a hashtag related to the conflict, then the bot would rewatch the video. And if it didn't have a hashtag related to the conflict, it would just kind of swipe up to the next video.
And you mentioned earlier that because the investigation is focused more on what's going on in the Israel-Hamas war and how young people are consuming the news. Did this seem to you to be more pro-Israel or pro-Palestine? What was that? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So it was more pro-Palestine, although it's kind of, I think we didn't start the investigation until several days after the October 7th attack. And so I suspect had we started it earlier, it might have been more pro-Israel. But by the time we started watching, about 59% of the videos that TikTok served were kind of pushed more pro-Palestinian perspectives, and about 15% pushed more pro-Israel perspectives. Obviously, 59% and 15% don't add up to 100%, but that's because not all of the videos had what appeared to be like a really clear perspective.
And so, Georgia, in response to allegations against bias on TikTok, the company did put out a statement saying our recommendation algorithm doesn't take sides and has rigorous measures in place to prevent manipulation. Is that something that you found to be true or reflect in your reporting and your own experience with this?
Yeah. So our reporting didn't really get into the nitty gritty of what was happening behind the scenes. It was simply just here's the breakdown of the videos that TikTok served our bots. But because by the time we started watching, the conflict had kind of shifted towards more the kind of Israeli kind of push into Gaza. I don't know whether TikTok was putting their thumb on the scale, but none of the reporting kind of suggested necessarily that they were. Yeah.
And I guess one could argue, isn't this how TikTok works with all of its content? Does this have a differentiation from those contents?
No. And so that's part of what's really interesting here is that in this experiment, what TikTok ended up serving the bots was really quite extreme rabbit holes. And that's similar to when I'm scrolling TikTok and I've had a rough day and I'm looking at cute animal video after cute animal video, I'll end up really deep in a rabbit hole of cute puppies and cute kittens. But I think most people wouldn't look at that, or maybe they would, but it's not such a question of the effect that could have on my mental health or on my understanding of the world so much, because we're talking about cute animals. But when you have a rabbit hole that's so zeroed in on such intense content, when it's video after video of war footage, and these accounts were set up to be 13 years old, I think that's what really kind of raises questions about the effect of rabbit holes on kind of the development of young people and how they learn about these types of conflicts when it's through these more kind of skewed universes of rabbit holes.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that just because we are talking about content that's more extreme than the cute animal videos that you're talking about that we watch for our mental health. And so I guess on the flip side, I want to ask, can this content help younger people to bear witness and be exposed to new and different perspectives and issues, especially ones that might not reflect in traditional media, as we mentioned earlier?
So I think that's a great question. I think definitely like the promise of social media absolutely can expose people to as many different perspectives, like that are kind of far away from their living room if they're sitting in San Francisco or New York City or wherever they're kind of living out their life, right? But the nature of some of these rabbit holes was quite a bit more like either if they were in the pro-Palestinian rabbit holes, it was very pro-Palestinian, or it's in the very pro-Israeli rabbit holes, very pro-Israeli, and there wasn't a tremendous amount of kind of alternate perspectives offered into these rabbit holes. And Michael earlier made the point of content that's kind of extreme versus propaganda versus content that has the express purpose of trying to inform us. And I think that's really top of mind here, because some of the videos I came across were like, I think pretty informative. One of them was a history teacher kind of doing these 30-second histories of the Middle East. But a lot of the content that spreads the most on social media often is more extreme. Can I share like 2 examples of content that really stuck with me? But I just want to preface this with a content warning.
Sure, go ahead. We got about a minute and a half left.
Oh, perfect. So one of the videos was a woman describing the phone call she received from her son, who was at the Nova Music Festival near the Gaza border, and how she was on the phone with him when he was killed. And another video was a woman in Gaza City, and you can hear the bombing in the background, and she's talking to the camera, and she's explaining why she's decided she doesn't want to lose her home, and she doesn't want to leave that night, and she's worried she might not survive the night. And both of those videos were these like incredibly intense, scary videos that kind of, if it's a 13-year-old watching these, they're not that graphic, but I think they still, I'm not sure they're particularly appropriate for a 13-year-old, but yeah.
Well, on that note, 30 seconds left. Is there a way to find a balance for the younger audiences between the serious content and the not serious content? 30 seconds.
I think, unfortunately, because of the nature of the rabbit holes, balance is not something that they've currently, prioritized that much in the way they're designing the app. But I think that's definitely something that like parents should be thinking about going forward when they're helping their children select which apps to use.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thanks to Georgia Wells. She's a tech reporter with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Catherine.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.